If we've learned one thing at DRI, it's how much those of you in the resilience field value real-world knowledge and experience of your fellow professionals. That's why we ask an impressive panel of master business continuity professionals, each representing a variety of industries and with wide range of experience, to answer your questions. And they have accepted the challenge. I'm Russell Wooldridge, Senior Director of Business Development for DRI International, welcoming you to the latest in our webinar series. We received dozens upon dozens of outstanding questions covering topics including BCM plan development, executive buy-in, corporate culture, and cyber resilience, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can today. The highest level of certification you can earn with DRI, MBCPs are distinguished among their peers and sought after by employers for their superior knowledge and significant experience. Earning an MBCP also comes with the coveted distinction of membership in the Order of Sword and Shield National Honor Society, the only academic and professional honor society dedicated solely to the security learning community. Joining us today are four such experts. Carla Glass, Lead Facilities Planner for Corporate and Enterprise Services at Northrop Grumman Corporation. Melanie J. Lucht, Associate Vice President and Chief Risk Officer for Enterprise Risk Management at Carnegie Mellon University. Brian S. Mitchell, Director of IT, Global Cybersecurity Command and Response, GCCR, and Information Security at FedEx Services IT. And Michelle L. Turner, Head of Corporate Business Continuity at Amazon. As I said, we received a wide variety of in-depth questions during the registration period. But if you still have some you'd like addressed, you can submit them during the presentation in the box on the bottom left hand. Our speakers will cover them in a future issue of our biweekly e-newsletter drive. This presentation will also be on the webinars section of our website, drii.org. Now here's Buffy Rojas Leach, Director of Communications, to kick off the Q&A. Go ahead, Buffy.
Thanks, Russell, and welcome to all of you who are listening. We received so many great questions for our MBCPs. But before we get started, I do want to add a quick note that due to the confidential nature of their positions and the policies of their organizations, not every question could be answered publicly. With that said, let's begin with our first MBCP. Carla, if you could start out by telling us a little bit about yourself. How did you first enter into business continuity and resilience, and how has the field changed since then?
Yes, so I began my journey about 16 years ago when I started volunteering as an emergency medical technician. During college, I worked as a 911 dispatcher, and I was always intrigued by emergency communications. And then after finishing undergrad, I ended up taking that infamous year off. And during that time, Northrop Grumman recruited me to support the stand-up of their emergency response and crisis management program at one of their local sites. And from there, my responsibilities rapidly grew. As you know, when you have a passion for something, you tend to thrive in that environment. And so I found myself, before I knew it, leading the emergency response, crisis management, IT disaster recovery, and business continuity program globally. And as far as how the field has changed since then, when I first started this career, it was culturally acceptable across this industry to work in silos, particularly response to physical and cyber threats, as well as your education on those was very siloed. Today, that's no longer the case. There has to be information exchange. There has to be a structure that supports cohesive response. And there has to be a general understanding of the roles and responsibilities. So I think that's probably the greatest change that I have seen since entering into this role.
Thanks, Carla. So moving on, we'd like to find out a little bit about your MBCP certification. How long have you had an MBCP, and what are the benefits that you think it brings to working in your particular field? And lastly, would you recommend it to other BCM professionals?
I've been an MBCP since 2017, and although I've worked for years in this industry, Whenever I obtained my MBCP, it was because I wanted credentials to affirm my expertise in the field. The credentials, they establish you as an expert in the field. Credentials are also very important if you're meeting with customers or you're meeting with others in industry. And I definitely recommend having credentials. Sometimes that's often the first thing that sells you, and so it makes your introduction much easier and your acceptance as an expert. So I highly recommend the MBCP, as well as a continuing education that goes along with it that makes us stay fresh in our field, makes us stay current on all of the latest trends. Oftentimes I've found that without a CE requirement, people often become stagnant in their fields.
Thanks for that, Carla. As you know, a lot of certified professionals have submitted questions for you today, and then we're going to jump right into those. One person has asked, what are the biggest challenges BCM professionals face, and how do we conquer those early on?
I really like that question. So one of the biggest challenges that I see is that people often associate many tasks and the professions associated with those tasks as table stakes. An example is an auto mechanic. They don't spend the bulk of their working time marketing to people about why they need their oil changed. They spend most of their time physically servicing the vehicles. And the greatest challenge that I've found is that often BCM professionals must spend as much time or more time marketing and convincing people why they need forethought into structure and response to events than actually building the program itself. So when events are fresh, there tends to be this heightened focus, but sustaining that focus, I think, is one of the greatest challenges that we have. Another challenge is that silos have to be removed in order to have this imperative flow of information during events.
So, Carla, speaking of challenges, what's been the most challenging business interruption for which you've facilitated a response? What made it challenging, and how did you meet that challenge?
Although I've responded to much larger events, the most challenging interruption for me was Superstorm Sandy. And the reason that was so challenging was that the structure we had in place was very IT-centric, and it hadn't been practiced for non-IT events. So what ultimately happened was we focused heavily on what we did well, and that was IT response. And that ended up overshadowing everything else. Fortunately, we learned a lot, and there were no grave impacts based upon the actions we took. But meeting that challenge in the moment required an immense amount of chaos coordination. And post-event, it was critical that we perform a post-event analysis and do course correction so that we didn't repeat that same issue in the future.
Thanks for that. So it sounds like there's a significant amount of testing and exercising involved in your program. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, the testing of plans after they've been developed?
Yes, absolutely. So testing is critical. So plans are only theories until they have actually been tested. So our testing program matured over time. And for those of you who are just starting your program, don't fret if you're still at ground level. There has to be a starting point. So initially we started with structured walkthroughs of our plans. Then we moved on to guided testing, where we help facilitate the testing to ensure that the correct actions were being taken. And then eventually we moved on to testing as closely to a real disaster as possible. And our testing program to this day is not a one-size-fits-all model. critical business and applications are required to test more frequently than our less critical business and applications.
Thanks, Carla, for sharing your approach to testing. Let's move on to this next question. And this person asks, what is a successful approach to moving business continuity front and center with approved funding?
That's a great question. So in order to move your program front and center with approved funding, I'll share how I was successful at doing that. I was very successful in receiving buy-in by setting up a maturity model that illustrated where we were and where we needed to be across each of the main areas. For us, those were emergency response, crisis management, IT disaster recovery, business continuity plans, and emergency communications. And in addition to laying out the current state, also showing where we needed to be and the risk associated with not being there. I think it's always helpful to have a visual and a repeatable frame of reference. And this frame of reference allowed leadership to weigh in on the progress being made with their investment. They could see that there was forward progress based upon the investments they were making.
So, Carla, you talked a little bit about top management. This next person asks, how should top management view operational resilience in BCN?
Top management should view resilience as table stakes, an imperative to meet our customer needs regardless of the climate we're operating in. But also, resilience should be viewed as a competitive differentiator. It should be a part of the company's brand.
Carla, so the next person asks, who plays the role of governance for BCP? How is this different at the management, senior management, and board level?
The way I established our program was that the Enterprise Crisis Management Team served as the steering committee when we were not responding to an event. So the governance was at that senior management level, and this ensured that the people supporting event response were knowledgeable of the comprehensive program and had a sense of ownership prior to an event. This doesn't vary greatly for us at the management, senior management, and board level. So our senior management served on that steering committee. And then we had feeder structures into that overall governance model. And we also ensured that from top down, everyone understood where key decisions were made and where the limitations of those decisions were and when those would have to be escalated to more senior leadership or the board. And it was very important for there to be ownership even at the lowest levels. So our tagline was, a culture of resilience begins with you. And it was important for employees to know how they fed up into that overall company governance during events.
Thanks for that, Carla. And I think that ties in well to our next question, which is, where is the best place to start when rolling out a BCP initiative?
When rolling out a BCP initiative, you must garner support top-down, but you also have to garner support bottoms-up. Leadership should understand the vision and be willing to remove obstacles, but you should never downplay that you have to have the buy-in of those expected to deploy the initiative, because their commitment to the initiative is what's going to determine the quality of your results. One of the biggest mistakes that I frequently hear about in industry is when people try to roll out a BCP program and they start with reporting structure. A good program is less about who reports to whom and it's more about the relationship of the right people and the relationship of the right data.
So Carla, the next question is this. When there are programs and departments already in existence for human safety and cybersecurity, what other areas in business continuity have the highest priority to bring the most value for a company? In your experience, are there certain areas of business continuity that take precedence over others?
Yes, two of the biggest mishaps in event response are communications turning into chaos and the speed by which we respond and recover. As you know, speed is money whenever you are in a corporation. So planning is important, and I don't want to downplay that. But to me, the first two priority focus areas should be structure and communication. I recommend that every company go through and map out how communication should flow into a unified status. That often will reveal which functions should sit on a top-level crisis management team, and then you can identify the roles and responsibilities, your testing, establish your lower-level actions for your program. But I definitely think that communications and structure are imperative to address early on in the program.
Thanks for that, Carla. I know another important thing and something that is challenging for certified professionals is third parties. And this person asked a question about that. They want to know, how can we engage third parties and include their plans if there are known interdependencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. Engagement with third parties proactively is imperative. If that third party is hosting your data, I recommend you build in your disaster recovery requirements at the contract level and then have periodic validation that they are meeting your planning and testing requirements. If that third party is a prime or a subcontractor, I recommend you plan and test collaboratively. And if that third party is a supplier or a service provider, I recommend you engage them while developing your plan so you know how to be the first person in line to receive that product or that service post-event.
So now let's switch our focus to another important group, employees. What level of interaction is your organization involved with employee preparedness?
Yes, our company is very committed to the employee population. We do a series of preparedness messages throughout the year that are geared toward particular seasons in that particular region, such as hurricane season or winter weather season. We also send out the FEMA resources for National Preparedness Month in September, things such as how to have a plan or build a kit. Additionally, through our partnership with organizations like the Red Cross, we extend messages about ways to get involved and be trained to support your local community. There have also been days that we've brought in speakers from the Red Cross, CPR instructors, or others into our campuses. So we definitely believe in preparedness expanding beyond just preparedness in the workplace.
So this is another employee-related question. How is your organization embracing or not the increase in remote work? What positives and negatives are you noticing?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to comment on this question from a limited perspective, as I'm not certain how it's affecting productivity and retention. But from a resilience perspective, we do extend our validation of safety for certain event types to remote workers. And many of our resources post-event are available to remote workers. However, we have had to be very deliberate in building a communications model that doesn't position us to become the local weather reporter. But as far as positives and negatives in productivity, retention, I'm not certain how remote work's affecting that, but definitely think that we have to consider remote work when it comes to taking care of those lone workers.
Thanks for that. Carla, how would you describe your department's connection or relationship with your organization's IT department?
Yes, within our organization, we have a robust partnership where we mutually appreciate the work of each other and recognize the critical role that each contributes to the company's overall resilience posture. We definitely cannot work in silos. We work jointly and understand that IT is critical to the recovery of our business, and that business should be providing requirements to IT. So it's very, although not in a reporting structure connected, it's definitely operationally connected.
Thanks for that, Carla. So how can we achieve synergy between business continuity and ITDR development if these are happening around the same time?
You will actually hear me shout this from the rooftops. Success of your program boils down to relationships. Achieving synergy between business continuity program and the IT disaster recovery program begins with the relationship of the people, so build a partnership. Also imperative is the relationship of data. Can you truly say that a business process is resilient when you don't know the planning and testing of applications it is dependent on to recover? Likewise, can you really set RTOs and RPOs without the business weighing in on when they need those applications? Business continuity and ITDR should not be competing, but should be complementing the other in order to give a more comprehensive view of the company's risk and resilience.
So, Carla, this person asks, given the amount of time and the cost associated with maintaining ITDR plans and how rarely they're used during an actual event, is there any effort underway to come up with a more practical and useful process in today's complex IT environment?
If I knew who submitted this question, I would hug his or her neck. In my prior role, we worked diligently to change our entire approach to risk assessment and the BIA on the business continuity side. We made it dynamic, so the end user built their plan based on what we really saw as risk for them. And then when I moved to my new role, we hadn't built that out on the IT side yet. I'm hopeful that that will continue, but I think there's definitely opportunity to make the process more integrated, more efficient, and quite frankly, more useful and available in the moment. I hope that this is a movement within industry, but I definitely wasn't waiting on industry to change it, and I highly recommend that everyone take a look at opportunities within their own program to reduce the rigid requirements and place requirements on the business and on the application owners that make sense to reduce risk within the company and to allow us to respond quickly and have that data available when it's needed.
Thanks for that very useful and unique perspective, Carla. Much appreciated. The last question that we have for you today is this. What are the greatest challenges with the new direction of disaster recovery using the cloud?
I think right now the greatest challenge with the cloud is the unknown. People tend to fear something that is new and something that changes the way we have traditionally done things. We all know there has to be good security hygiene for the cloud to be effective, but that isn't grossly different than what expectations should be outside of the cloud. And quite frankly, many studies show improved security in cloud environments. There are many pros to cloud environments for disaster recovery professionals and for reducing company risk. I think the key to being successful is being receptive to technology changes and having a mindset that regardless of the technology trend, we must still map out the flow of communications if technology fails and have the relationships in place to support the response and the resolution. There should be plans built around that. Just because we move to cloud does not mean that planning goes away, but we also should not be afraid of the cloud.
Carla, thanks so much for that great answer and for your time today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now for our next MBCP, Melanie Lucht. Hi, Melanie. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to start off by finding out a little bit about you. How did you first enter into business continuity and resilience? How has the field changed since then? I know everyone has a unique story, so we'd like to hear yours.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Buffy. So it's really interesting, and I think we all kind of, like you said, have an interesting story. But I pretty much fell into business continuity nearly 12 years ago, and it was back at the time when business continuity was still getting confused with disaster recovery for IT, and it was continuing to be kind of an emerging discipline, I guess, at that time. And since then, a whole new world has emerged around business continuity. The explosion of social media, cloud computing, and a more proactive focus towards organizational resiliency has really helped change the whole conversation around business continuity. And I actually fell into it just because I had previous work experience with an insurance carrier, and I was teaching risk management at a local university as an adjunct. And so business continuity to my future employer just seemed like it made sense, which was interesting, but it really then sparked a whole new career for me. And one of the things that I've learned over the years as our environment continues to evolve and change is that we continue to draw plenty of examples of the value of business continuity and really support the argument for why it's so valuable just because of all the examples of disruptions that we have on almost a daily basis. We can draw from examples. But thank you. That's a great question.
Thanks, Melanie. So you're part of our webinar today because you have a lot of great things to say and also because you have your MBCP certification. So I'd like to ask you about that. How long have you had your MBCP certification, and what are the benefits, and would you recommend it and why to other BCM professionals?
Sure. So I earned the MBCP certification in February of 2015. It was really important for me as a part of my professional development and career growth. It was one of my goals that I had. I really looked up to other MBCPs in the field. I saw them as really the experts, and I wanted to be in that same atmosphere with them, particularly because I believe this designation shows that you're an expert in your field. This is not an easy designation to earn, but it demonstrates that you've invested in your professional development and that you've gained a high level of expertise. This also gives you credibility in your profession and legitimacy within your organization. And I would strongly recommend it to other professionals because this designation can truly increase not only your earning potential, but also your marketability.
Thanks, Melanie. So let's dive into some of that expertise. We've got a lot of questions from our certified professionals, so we're going to jump in with this one, which we're going to ask of all of our panelists today. What has been the most challenging business interruption for which you've facilitated a response? What made it challenging, and how did you meet that challenge?
Sure. This is an excellent question. And I think thing that resonates with me still to this day was Hurricane Sandy. That was one of the more challenging interruptions that I've encountered. While I was not in higher education at the time, I was part of a team within a large bank that worked collaboratively to facilitate alternate work locations, hotel accommodations, overnight deliveries of laptops, restoration of technology services, basically everything that would encompass not only emergency response and remediation, but ensuring continuity of our critical services. And it was challenging. While we knew that essential functions needed to continue to support customers, we also understood that people needed to take care of themselves and their families, and really recognizing and appreciating what is truly important during a time of crisis. And the value of effective communications and logistics to make sure that we can mitigate those negative impacts was a valuable learning experience. There's no disruption or disaster that we come out of that doesn't give us an opportunity to reflect, to discuss what worked well and where we had challenges, and what we can do to improve in the future to further strengthen our resiliency. But one of the things that I learned from that disruption and others along the way is that this is not done by one person. It truly takes the collaborative efforts of a team to be successful and to take care of each other.
So the next question I have from our certified professionals is this: what is the successful approach to moving business continuity front and center with approved funding? I know we just talked about your most challenging incident. In the absence of an incident, how do you really put the spotlight on business continuity?
Sure. Well, this is a great question because especially if approved funding has been allocated, that in and of itself is a huge win because clearly approved funding means that you've made a really good case for why this is important. So I think the first step in moving business continuity front and center to continue to get the groundswell support for that is you really have to establish a really solid business process. And that process really you should be aligning to your corporate culture or whatever your culture is and the strategic objectives of that culture. While you can leverage and adopt processes that are relatively standard and internationally recognized, you would still need to translate this to your community in a way that they will understand, that they could support, get behind, and become engaged in. One of the things that has worked for me is making sure that with the design of this program that you want to get off the ground, or maybe that you want to redesign, do you have flexibility to pilot what you're doing with some key stakeholders to gain early adoption and begin building that network of champions, and making sure that people clearly understand what your short and long-term plans would be, being very clear about why your stakeholders' assistance can demonstrate a return on the investment, that they actually have the opportunity to influence a positive outcome. And sometimes this all really starts with just one conversation that in turn would build trust amongst your colleagues. If they see that you're invested and passionate about what you're trying to do, at a minimum they're going to respect and appreciate where you're coming from. But at the same time, you have to deliver. This requires a lot of communication. You really have to be a bit extroverted, perhaps in a few ways. You really have to have a high level of engagement, and you need to follow up. So designing that process in a way that gets people involved from the beginning so that they too feel invested, I think is one approach that could be considered.
Thanks for that. It sounds like a big challenge, which leads into our next question, which is, what are the biggest challenges business continuity professionals face, and how do we conquer those early on?
Yeah, this is a great question that I know we all have challenges in our professional careers, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we as BCM professionals continue to experience is getting that buy-in and getting the time and space on people's calendars to enable their ownership of their plans. We find ourselves continuously providing training, awareness, conducting refreshers, and even doing a lot of follow-up to make sure that the plans that we work with our colleagues to create are current, that they're relevant, and that they really add value to the organization. Making plans simple and straightforward and ensuring that the systems that manage those plans are user-friendly really can be key success factors. But I think one of the things that we as professionals can really do to overcome these challenges is that frequent and transparent communication along with a high level of engagement. That's essential. You want to demonstrate to your community that you're invested in this. And while it might take some time, over time, business continuity can become a part of the culture, but it's something that requires patience and persistence.
So one of the challenges that our certified professionals often face, in addition to what you just spoke about, is testing. There's a lot of time and effort put into the planning part, and then testing is challenging. It's something that's difficult to do. It's complicated, and so a lot of our certified professionals asked us to ask you about your testing program. What does that program look like, and how was it developed? If you could talk to your testing program, that would be very helpful.
Sure. And so we do testing both from a business continuity perspective as well as a disaster recovery perspective. And they're two completely different things, but I think one of the things that we try to capitalize on is that testing a plan after it's been developed is really a perfect opportunity to make sure that the plan meets the needs of the organization. It continues the momentum. Once that plan has been developed and approved, that's the time to really put it to the test. And designing an exercise that will align with the critical services and processing periods that the organization has. So designing an exercise in a way that's customized to the people that will be implementing those plans will resonate much stronger with the people participating in that exercise. And that scoping the exercise so that you can map it back to standards that you've created so that it can provide the assurance that this is another best practice. And if you need to keep plans in accordance with certain standards, it's also a good opportunity to conduct a self-assessment against those international standards. For example, ISO 22301. Look, these are the plans that we've tested, and how does that map to that standard to see where you might have potential gaps in your own program. But I think one of the things that is really helpful is providing a calendar of sorts to your constituents to say, this is when your plan has been approved. This is the next reasonable time that you should do the test. We're going to help you every step of the way, and we're going to set the expectation that this is the time of year that this is when we're going to do this test, so that it just becomes part of a rhythm and a cycle of standard operating procedure.
Thanks for that. So another question that came in is a question about what's really important in planning. And the person who asked this question asks, when there are programs and departments already in existence for human safety and cybersecurity, two very important topics, what other areas in business continuity have the highest priority to bring the most value for a company? In your experience, are there areas in business continuity that are just really important and should take precedence over others?
Sure, that's a great question. Safety is above all the most important thing, and it's not even so much a priority as it is a value. And there are programs and departments within any particular organization that focuses on human safety as well as cybersecurity. Those organizations have business processes, and they provide critical services, and they themselves would need to have business continuity plans in place that supports their critical services. So, if those groups have difficulty with continuity, that's going to represent a potential significant downstream impact on the other processes that depend upon them. And strategically, it's really important to identify, early on, what are the highest priorities of the organization. No two organizations are alike, and looking at the strategic plan, looking at the long-term objectives of the organization can help to identify what those priorities are. And then from there, establishing a recovery objective structure that would align to those priorities can help to guide that future prioritization of recovery.
Thanks for that. The next question we have, I think, really relates to the first question that we asked you about your most challenging recovery. And this one, you mentioned Hurricane Sandy, I think will definitely relate. What do you recommend to help plan for recovery from a major natural disaster where employees may not be able to return to work for an extended time?
Sure, absolutely. This kind of aligns perfectly to what we were talking about earlier with Hurricane Sandy. And I think it does go back to prioritization of critical services and when those services need to be up and running at an acceptable level. And the truth be told, some employees may not be able to return to work because they can only perform their job on site. Some people, some employees may have remote capabilities where they can demonstrate continuity. But I think this is where it becomes a really great opportunity to partner with human resources colleagues. They're key because whatever policies or procedures are in place or maybe need to be in place to support employees during times of disruption and during times of crisis. Focusing on the health and well-being of employees is actually more important during those times of crisis. And so, if employees see that you're focused on making sure that they're okay and that they have what they need to support themselves and care for their family, as opposed to the bottom line, then that's going to be really key. If employees see that all you're worried about is making sure that they can, finish the report, or if they can, sign that, whatever, piece of work that you're doing, that's an employee you won't have for much longer.
Thanks, Melanie. So the next question does tie in to natural disasters a bit and also risk. And I know you talked about having a background in risk management before, so this one's perfect for you. What tools and resources do you use for identifying the risk for natural and human-induced hazards for your locations? And the asker of this question is trying to get at what data and information is available to assess risk more than what tools are used to record those assessments. So if you could address that, that would be very helpful.
Sure. I think if you're looking at the tools and resources to identify risks, for the hazards that are in our environment, I would actually recommend leveraging the tools and resources that should already be available to you from your local, county, and state emergency management entities, particularly because these entities would have a hazard mitigation plan that has either been approved or is approved pending adoption through FEMA. There is a wealth of data and a wealth of information really that can be used and leveraged to help customize whatever you need for your specific location. So it's not so much a matter of reinventing the wheel, but take the information that has already been gathered and then map it to your specific area to help inform your process and your planning.
So moving away from natural disasters into really what's the hottest topic in business continuity right now, let's talk a bit about cyber resilience and cybersecurity. Can you tell us how you've incorporated cybersecurity and cyber resilience into your business continuity program?
Sure. This is a fantastic question because cybersecurity is something that is a significant risk to all of our institutions. And we partner really closely with our information security colleagues. They themselves support critical business processes and services, and they themselves have business continuity plans to support those things. And so, as a part of that ongoing collaboration and partnership, we actually recently hosted a cybersecurity panel discussion for several of our peer organizations and several of our risk executives in the higher education landscape. And in that panel discussion, we invited CISOs from neighboring higher ed institutions as well as the FBI to provide their perspective on this landscape as well as effective risk mitigation techniques. Again, along with that partnership, we conduct exercises pretty frequently with not only our information security colleagues, but with our technology crisis management team. And those exercises have included things like distributed denial of service attacks, phishing attacks, ransomware, and advanced persistent threat scenarios. And we really try to put ourselves to the test through tabletop exercises of how we would really all work together to make sure that we're protecting our environment, being as transparent as we can be with our constituents, and making sure that using this all-hazard approach towards business continuity planning is really important. Even though that there might be a particular disruption that is aligned with a security incident, it basically goes back to your technology dependency is not accessible, so what are your workarounds? What are your other processes that you might implement and activate that can ensure your continuity? And so everyone has a responsibility really to not only develop that level of resiliency, gain that level of awareness, but also make sure that we're all trained as professionals, as stewards of our organizations, that we're giving ourselves the opportunity to be trained to be able to identify potential cyber threats, escalate those threats, and make sure that we're very aware of the emails that we receive that contain attachments that we might not be completely familiar with, and just being a little more diligent in how we operate in cyberspace.
So this next question is near and dear to my heart as someone who works from home. How is your organization embracing, or not, the increase in remote work? What positive and negatives are you noticing in workflow, productivity, retention?
Sure, and this is really a unique situation, especially working in a university environment. A university functions very much like a municipality, and sometimes remote work doesn't necessarily fit for everyone. However, where it's appropriate, it's definitely provided a significant amount of flexibility for staff and for productivity. People frequently comment to me that they can actually get more done at home because there's less distractions. And actually a few years ago we conducted an alternate work location exercise with one of our finance teams that didn't at the time have laptops. And what we learned from that experience was that provisioning laptops for people was actually more cost effective and created greater efficiencies than it did in going through the effort and the time and expense of trying to set up alternate work locations with redundant equipment and temporary technology support. So we actually found that it's not only increasing productivity, it's helping to manage cost.
Okay, so Melanie, you just talked about how you work at a university, and I have a question here that I think is just uniquely suited for you, since I know you went from industry into the university environment. And this person asks, I'm a business continuity and crisis management advisor in healthcare, and I'm moving into a BCM crisis management role at a large multi-campus university. What aspects of the university should I identify as unique and need to appreciate in my first weeks and months of planning there?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, I'd love to meet you because I think it's really a unique experience going from a corporate environment into a university environment. University is an entirely different culture than most, and I love working at a university. It's just the energy and the things that come out of of a university environment from a creativity and from an innovation perspective is just really fascinating. But again, like I said earlier, a university operates like a municipality. There's a wide variety of people that comprise that universe. You've got students, you've got administrators, there's professors, there's researchers, and then you have police and facilities managers. So it's really just a cross-function of society. And when you start in this particular role, I think it's a really great idea to go on a bit of a listening tour. And you start with the people that interviewed you for the position. They've already demonstrated that they have confidence in your ability to do the job. And they might also give you the names of other people that they think you should talk to for the purpose of gaining that cultural perspective. They will appreciate your willingness to be collaborative and to actively listen. And the key people to engage with right away are also the people that you're going to have to work with at some point in time in order to be successful. So whether that is the police or facilities management or environmental health and safety, it really depends on the size and the scale of the institution. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's important to go to the people that really make that university function behind the scenes, especially anyone that's been there a long time. And just appreciate and give yourself some breathing room, knowing that it's going to take time to build relationships. It's going to take time for people to get to know you. But if they see that you're invested and that you're passionate, and that you're also coming from a place of vulnerability where you're not the know-it-all, and there's probably someone at that university that knows way more than you, but that you give yourself that time and space to just build that early network of champions, I think is probably one of the best pieces of advice that I can provide.
Well, I'll see about making that connection between you and the person who asked that question after we finish here. So the last question I have for you is elevator pitch. Can you give us your best elevator pitch for business continuity?
Sure. I think keeping it simple, keeping it fairly in layman's terms. I think if you start talking about things like activity, context, and business impact analyses, that could be a turnoff. I think instead if you give that elevator speech to someone where you're telling them how you're trying to help people create their plan B, and that you're actually doing most of the heavy lifting. You could reference a recent event that demonstrate how having that plan B was really valuable, and that you're trying to do the same thing, and keeping it high level. But that once you have that verbal support in the elevator, you can then follow up with that person about more in-depth topics like training and awareness and BIA. But I think keeping it as high level and as enticing as possible about why this is such a great idea, but also relieving some maybe early anxieties about the level of work, I think would also be a really big selling point.
Great. Thanks so much for your time today, Melanie. We really appreciate it.
No, thanks for the opportunity to visit with you. I really appreciate it.
So now let's hear from Brian Mitchell. Brian, thanks for joining us today. Let's start out by hearing a little bit more about you. Can you talk about your career path? How did you first enter into business continuity and resilience, and how has the field changed since then?
That's a great question. So it's arguable that I have been in some form of business continuity or risk management my entire career across multiple disciplines, whether it was in finance or operations. There was always some aspect of a risk management role associated. but I guess I formally entered into that discipline about 5 years ago when I moved into a role over business continuity and disaster recovery and information security. And of course, that was a discipline associated with planning for multiple different types of outcomes across anything from disasters related to weather and geographic forces to those things that ranged into cyber. So that's probably when I came full circle into a very structured business continuity role that exercised influence across about 18 different domains of information security. How the field has changed since then is pretty significant or insignificant depending on how you look at it. 5 years ago, this concept of cloud was in its infancy in terms of moving away from true disaster recovery to high availability and resiliency. So there are new tools and new capabilities across that spectrum to work with, depending on the organization and how you prioritize and or can invest. So cloud is new to the discussion. And then when you take a look at geopolitics, as well as the economics associated with disaster recovery, those are equally focused on these days, I guess is how I would put it. Really the last couple of years we've seen, I think all of us, we've seen a tremendous shift in focus associated with things that happen now that weren't so common 5 years ago.
Thanks for that, Brian. So how long have you had your MBCP certification? What benefits do you think it brings to working in your particular field? And lastly, why would you recommend that to other BCM professionals?
So I've had my MBCP certification for about 3 years now. I had the opportunity to attend some DRI training down at Emory University about 3 years ago. It was a great course, great instructor, and I was amazed at the end of it how it kind of pulled everything together. Really what I think my MBCP certification has done for me, has provided me, is a more complete or comprehensive understanding of the risk spectrum and really the comprehensive efforts that go into planning, compensating controls, and mitigations, depending on what threat it is you're working to insulate your organization from. So really everything from course of action development to coordinating with third parties and incident responders. The training and the certification, I thought, did a very effective job of pulling that all together into a continuum. To me, I see DR as being kind of the tip of the risk pyramid. It's the top echelon. It's what happens when all other programs, capabilities, or efforts to contain an event fail or come up short. So understanding and mastering the discipline of business continuity, I believe, makes you more effective at planning in advance of that event, or therefore delivering a better outcome regardless. So I see it as kind of encapsulating the full spectrum of operations. And it's for all of those reasons that I would recommend the discipline and or the pursuit of an MBCP certification. It's an effective way to ensure that you have a full understanding of how all the various pieces fit together, so that if you have to exercise some type of a disaster recovery protocol, you've put in the effort ahead of time to ensure the best outcome possible.
Thanks. So moving along here, you talked a bit about how the field has changed since you first entered it. A definite change is work from home. It's certainly increased. I work from home myself. And this person asks, how is your organization embracing or not the increase in remote work? What positives and negatives are you noticing in workflow, productivity, and retention?
So remote work is an interesting paradigm. To me, it depends on the position or the application. Understanding what the team member is going to be asked to do and how well that really fits a remote worker assignment. Some positions are optimal for remote team members, and others, sometimes not so much. It depends on the amount of daily interaction they need to have with other team members and really the specifics of what you're asking them to do. But to me, it's about taking a balanced approach. It's a balancing act between the team member and whether they have the personal discipline to be effective as a remote team member. It's the nature of the role, like I said, but it's also the effectiveness of the manager or leader responsible for that team member. And all three things have to fit to be successful. There are tremendous benefits from leveraging remote team members, not only from a geographically dispersed perspective of whether systems impacting one organization may not impact all of its team members, really to something you touched on, which is recruiting and retention. There are some remarkable opportunities in that respect as well. And it's actually one of the more interesting elements of remote team member agreements these days, at least in my opinion, being able to pull in team members from markets without having to geographically disrupt really their lives. So it can be an interesting prospect. But what I found is that when it fits, it works very well. Having team members that are decentralized from primary operations can add remarkable resiliency from a BCM perspective across impacts ranging from weather to really even time zone differences. So it allows you to span the clock a little bit differently depending on where team members are located.
So this person asks about business continuity professionals in your organization and what role they're playing in cyber incident planning and response. Can you speak to that?
So as I mentioned, business continuity and disaster recovery I see as kind of being the top echelon of a pyramid of risk or risk management. And those programs are what kick in when all other attempts to contain, disrupt, and remediate fall short for whatever reason. So a very significant role associated with incident response and incident response planning from a continuity perspective. One of my primary roles is, in fact, incident response from a cyber perspective. So my experience is that a fundamental understanding of business continuity helps me better understand the enterprise services that might need to come into play should my incident response team's efforts fall short or even should they be overwhelmed. So being able to very succinctly execute or orchestrate a handoff or even enhancing my team's capabilities from a containment and remediation perspective are improved by understanding the role, sort, and task organization of the teams around us, particularly our business continuity team. So I find that to be of tremendous value. Plus, having a fundamental understanding of what our business continuity teams are focused on, where they're creating resiliency, allows my teams to shift their focus to less resilient assets or capabilities. So it's truly a partnership, so to speak.
All right. So the next question is about another hot topic. And this person asks, what are the greatest challenges with the new direction of disaster recovery using the cloud? So
I see one of the greatest challenges as being able to drill down into the details of the particular cloud offering and fundamentally understanding not only what the provider's business continuity plan is and what capabilities they have, but how effective those plans might be given different types of outages. So it's understanding exactly what you're buying and how effective the provider can support that commitment. And then how do you test it? Other challenges are understanding the cost factors versus resiliency. So making very well-informed decisions on the precursor investment necessary to provide the resiliency that you need, given all of the various options, flavors, and possibilities. Also assessing the security posture from a third-party perspective or a risk perspective of the cloud provider, I think can also be challenging depending on the size of your organization, the size of the engagement with the provider. So again, it kind of goes back to understanding exactly what you're purchasing and how secure it is. But the reality, in my opinion, is that most cloud providers are very effective at business continuity planning and security, but you have to understand what you're buying, and the devil tends to be in the details.
So this next question comes from a certified professional who's dealing with a cloud issue right now. And this person writes, we're thinking of mandating recovery to a separate region, but wonder if a separate availability zone would be sufficient. And the first part of their question is, when moving an application to the public cloud, what are the requirements for disaster recovery?
So again, it depends on the criticality of the application and the nature of the threat or threats that you're looking to offset. It's critical, at least to me, to characterize the nature of the threat and the type of impact you see it potentially causing. understanding what is most likely to occur so that you can plan around that. So, it's about being able to plan appropriately. So that's not really an answer, but it's at least some considerations maybe that would allow the submitter of the question to kind of flesh out what is truly appropriate. It depends on your recovery time objectives and the impacts to the business should those RTOs not be met, and the type of outage that might occur. Of course, with greater resiliency comes increased cost, so striking a balance, an objective balance between cost and resiliency is also critical. So a lot of questions, but unfortunately the answer is it depends. It depends on the application, what the application does, and really the characterization of the threat associated to that application to make sure that you're making good business decisions.
Well, Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to answer all of our questions today. We very much appreciate it.
Most welcome. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
And now let's wrap up with MBCP Michelle Turner. Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for being with us today. We certainly value your experience in the field and look forward to your answers to these questions. We'll start off with this one, which is, how did you first enter the field of business continuity and resilience? Everyone has their own unique story, and we'd like to hear yours. And also, how has the field changed since then?
Well, Buffy, thank you for inviting me to connect on this. Let's see, how did I first enter? It was back in, I believe, 1991. I had an opportunity to engage in the business recovery area, as we called it back then. I was doing background investigations for a major financial organization, and someone was going on leave, and they wanted me to step in and just handle the role for a couple of months. They said, Michelle, there's nothing that you need to do other than look at the papers and put pink for vendors and yellow for technology, and just sort of color code all of this information in this document. You don't even need to look at it. So, of course, I looked at it, and I had a couple of recommendations. And since then, the person didn't come back. However, I was able to take over that area and started to develop more of the business continuity from that business recovery piece. So when you talk about how has the field changed, it's really initially gone from disaster recovery, which was more systems, to business recovery when we started to understand the processes, to then business continuity that said, wait a minute, both of these really have to be under the same umbrella and work together. And then making sure that you tie in that risk aspect, understanding the threats and the vulnerabilities and the risks that would result and what mitigations from an operational risk perspective. So it's just been evolving as the environment, as the infrastructure, as our society evolves. We're evolving right along with it.
Try again. So in your answer, it seems you came to business continuity somewhat by chance, which is a common story. Getting an MBCP is something completely different. That's something that you really have to decide you want. So I'd like to hear a little bit about getting your MBCP certification. How long have you had it? What has been the benefit? And would you recommend it to others?
I would definitely recommend it for others. I believe I've had it for around 11 or so years. For me, what I really wanted to do was take my learning, my education, all of that to the next level. I had been in business continuity for a while, so I knew that I knew a little bit of something. However, what I really wanted to do was ensure that I could understand some of the more expansive techniques and situations relative to business continuity and really gauge them against what I had been driving to and managing to in the industry. So a lot of it was just ensuring that I had the certification based on my years of experience, but it also taught me a few things that I then applied to the organizations that I had worked with. So the benefit would be not only additional knowledge, having that certification to say, yeah, not only do you know the practice of the process, but you also know the theoretical and the reasons for that information. But for certain organizations, based on the complexity and the scale, it's just great to be able to have that expansive knowledge to be able to apply.
So let's dig into some of your expansive knowledge with this question from a certified professional who asks, where is the best place to start when rolling out a BCP initiative? How do you ensure that all departments that should be in the scope are covered?
Best place to start is at the top of the house. By that I mean in the event that you have identified significant business interruptions perhaps that had some challenging workarounds and maybe impacted your financials or impacted your ability to service your customers, those are reasons to ensure that you have some sort of program in place that would assist in mitigating those delays, latencies, or other. So as long as you have that sponsorship and that support, really it would be great at the C level, but especially the executive management level. That's where you really need to start. And when you talk about ensuring that all of the departments that should be in scope are in scope, that's where it's helpful really to get that feedback from those executive leaders or senior leaders to say, you know, within our organization, here are the different groups or areas that we have, and the leaders for those areas are X, and making sure that you can connect with them and have a liaison within that particular group, really to sync up. That's what's extremely helpful, making sure you understand some of the challenges that those departments have had in the past and what potential recommendations could be relative to business continuity, relative to ensuring they identify their critical services and they are able to have plans in place in an acceptable amount of time. Really showing that value. Those are the types of things that once you identify the departments that could actually assist them in wanting to work with you and understanding how you're going to help them be successful.
Thanks for that, Michelle. And so if we look at the news lately, it's been a lot of news stories about Hurricane Dorian, which leads us right into our next question, which is, what do you recommend to help plan for recovery from a major natural disaster where employees may not be able to return to work for an extended time?
So this depends on the recovery strategies that the organization has. It also depends on the policies and procedures that they have. And by that I mean, in terms of the recovery strategy, in the event that they're not able to return to the site for an extended period of time, what type of strategy have they worked out in terms of work from home? If work from home is an option for them, are they able to have the appropriate permissions? Can they remote in? Things of that nature. Are there any confidentiality things that would prohibit them from working from home? So those are the things that you need to think about. In addition, in the event that working from home is not an option, perhaps they have an opportunity to work at a different site that is still within that same area. Or perhaps they need to address geographical redundancy by having team members who are cross-trained at another site to do that work, to do the work that's considered to be the most critical as per their business impact analysis, and potentially have the other work that those team members would typically do deferred to another area or things of that nature. So there are a couple of different options in terms of being able to recover from a major natural disaster, but definitely that recovery strategy where there's geographic redundancy, that's one I would recommend in ensuring that we have cross-training in place.
So historically, we tend to get a lot more attention for business continuity right after an event. So in addition to that, what are other successful approaches to moving business continuity front and center with approved funding?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately or fortunately, right after a major event, business continuity is definitely on the minds and hearts of people. However, making sure that you have something that's sustainable to keep it at front and center is definitely necessary. We don't want to always have to lean on those unfortunate incidents to drive an approach home. So in terms of the successful approach and really bringing it front and center, what I found is I found a few things. One, yes, we leverage those previous interruptions that we've been through where either the response was not what we wanted and we knew that we needed to drive efficiencies. Leverage those business interruptions where we have proven that by having a documented plan, by identifying the critical services, understanding when they need to be recovered, ensuring that we had team members in place to address. Those types of things have been pretty successful in moving front and center. The other thing that I found is that typically when you ask specifically for funding on business continuity, if you do receive it, that's typically the first place that people go to start grabbing the funds back whenever we have a situation, whatever situation is needed, where additional funds are needed. However, if we take a look at, hey, I need funding for cross-training. I need funding to ensure that I'm able to apply these additional skill sets or have these additional skill sets available for team members. And by the way, in our doing so and being able to expand their knowledge, we're also assisting ourselves in being able to recover this particular service in the event of a business interruption. So I found that there are different ways to ensure that you're able to show the value of business continuity, and I would do that. I would ensure that team members, organizations continue just to show the value of business continuity and focus on those core nuggets in order to ensure that they can continue their business continuity process and program.
So Michelle, in your experience, what's the best strategy to conduct and maintain a grounded and applicable BIA for a multinational company?
Well, I'll tell you right off the top, let's acknowledge that at times the business impact analysis BIA seems to be a daunting task for a lot of organizations. It doesn't have to be that way. What I found is that in the event that we have a multinational organization, let's start with one particular area. 9 times out of 10, that area or that team is in a variety of geographies. And so in the event that we're able to identify those most critical services for that particular group, we have something of a platform to leverage with other groups, those same groups in other geographies. And so by doing so, we're able to say, you know, we've had this conversation. These are the critical services or functions that your team in Bratislava has. However, would these be the core services or functions for your areas in Manila? And really start with that as a base. That way it doesn't seem like you really have to start at ground zero, but then you're able to start identifying those things that are more specific to that geography. Maybe there are geopolitical things that have to be called out. Maybe there are other cultural aspects that have to be called out and recognized when addressing these particular topics. But I would acknowledge that first and really use that as a base. What I found is that once you have that information, it's easier then to go across the country. Now you need to do this per team, but it does a couple of things. Number one, it makes sure that people understand that they don't have to start from ground zero. Number two, it gives other team members in other geographies a really good understanding that you know their business at least at the highest level, and they trust you a little bit more to provide a little bit more information from a consultative perspective.
Excellent answer. I'm going to drill down here a little bit with the next question someone asked, which is, how do we ensure that the owner of a process defines a realistic RTO rather than attempting an overly ambitious time associated with a service level agreement?
That's a great question. What I found is that right off the top, people immediately will, and rightfully so, feel that their particular service is critical and therefore needs to be recovered immediately. So one of the things that I attempt to do is first I ask them, now help me understand for this particular service, what are the impacts to the organization in the event that this is not brought back up and running in X amount of time? Do we have any service level agreements, SLAs, or commitments with customers, either internal or external, that would cause us to have to recover this in that amount of time? In addition, depending on the technology within the organization, typically you can say, okay, if this needs to be recovered in an hour, well, let's take a look at what the cost-benefit analysis would be to be able to recover that. Now, I don't necessarily want people to immediately get nervous and then start really putting things under the cover that should be brought out. But this gives them an opportunity to say, you know what, the cost of this, bringing the system up and running or this process up and running is X. However, the cost in terms of costs associated with risk, be it financial, operational, legal, or whatever, is a little bit lower. So maybe this is one where, based on my risk appetite, I could potentially accept the risk around this area. But these are the types of things that as business continuity professionals, we can have a conversation on and really tell the story about how this could potentially roll out with that business owner. Get their information, customize it to what our approach is, and come up with something that would really work for them.
Thanks for that. At the beginning there, you mentioned that BIA seems quite daunting to some, and it's quite a challenge. And that leads right into our next question, which is, what are the biggest challenges BCM professionals face, and how do we conquer those early on?
You know, one of the biggest challenges is actually something that you brought up a little bit earlier when we talked about the fact that we have disasters, and immediately after a disaster, team members tend to focus wholly on business continuity. The challenge is, as humans, we have short memories. And so once that disaster is over, continuing to have that motivation or that reason for really driving on this, sometimes it seems to go away, at least from certain levels. What I would say the biggest challenge is continuing to ensure that the organization does not see business continuity as a project, that they see business continuity as a true program that has to be embedded in the culture and the structure of what we do in order to drive our mission. If our mission is tied to the service of customers or whatever our mission is tied to, in order for us to be able to drive that to fruition and be successful, we need to ensure that we have processes up and running and perhaps technology and other things. And so just ensuring that we always tie the business continuity program to our strategies, that there are individual projects within that program, but again, that the organization does not see this as just a project, because projects have beginning and ends, whereas a program is a continuous life cycle. And tying that to the organization strategies and driving value on that is key.
Thanks for that. One of the most visible parts of business continuity in an organization can be testing. And I know it's also a challenge for a lot of our professionals, and they did ask quite a few questions on this. So can you provide just some words of wisdom in your experience on testing?
I can, and I want to give a little bit of definition first. Testing, the way that I see it, there's exercising and there's testing. So for the exercise, I really look at the exercise as, you know, I'm providing general instruction on the scenarios. I'm walking through the plan. I'm at a tabletop. I present a scenario that says, hey, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and this has occurred, that type of thing, and then I expand on that scenario while the team member is ensuring that the information that they're saying they would need to recover is actually in the plan. And so we're exercising that just to make sure that from a general perspective and instruction, We understand roles and responsibilities. Is everything there? Are the comms correct? When it comes to testing, now that's where it's functional. That's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where we say, okay, we walked through this. We know we have the right general stuff in our plan. Now let's see if these standard operating procedures actually work. Let's see when we go to do a work transference whether or not the other side of the house, if it's a geographical redundancy situation, whether the other side has the appropriate permissions, whether they know how to get back and forth and do what needs to be done. Can they do this? Can they manage the volume that's managed day to day? And if they can't, what's the acceptable volume that they can manage? So these are some of the things that you need to think about as you think about the testing process and ensuring that everything is locked and loaded. In addition, right before any test or any exercise for that matter, we need to ensure that we identify those objectives right up front. And once we identify the objectives, we can state whether or not the objective was met or it wasn't met. I specifically didn't say whether or not it was a success or failure, because the reality is if we find out during a test or an exercise that something doesn't work, that's a safe environment typically. That's good news that you found it out then. You can actually apply that to your plans. Therefore, in the event of an actual disaster or an actual business interruption, you're able to leverage what you've just learned for that situation. So those are a couple of things that I think about when it comes to testing and ensuring that the testing, the lessons learned, and all of that are baked right back into your plan.
Excellent advice. We have quite a few questions here about top management, and I think I can summarize it here. What people are after is, in your opinion, how should top management view operational resilience and business continuity management?
You know, that's a great question, and I think in order to answer that question, we have to think about, well, what does top management typically care about in general? They, of course, care about the life safety of their employees. I don't think that there's any question that there. They also care about liability in terms of any financial restrictions, any regulatory concerns that could potentially impact their organization. Those are some of a couple of the things that they definitely care about. And so when we think about really communicating this at their level, we want to make sure that we're calling those particular areas out. I know there was a CIO for a major organization that I interviewed a few years back, and one of the things that he said is that the scare tactics really don't work, meaning don't try to tell me that, hey, all is lost, the sky is falling, and think that that's going to continue to have me support this particular program. Focus in on the corporate strategies, focus in on how not having this type of resiliency throughout the organization will perhaps impact our ability to have life safety with our employees. Tell me how it impacts our ability to really provide what our shareholders and stakeholders need. Those are the types of things that he recommended that we really focus on, just to make sure that we could get to the heart of it and get to those things that senior leadership and executive leadership really have on their plate on a regular basis. Can this be considered a competitive advantage in certain areas? If you take a look at some organizations that have gone through business interruptions and have taken a significant amount of time to recover, is there an opportunity for us to be able to streamline some of that time in order to have things back up and running in a time that's a little bit sooner than our competitors, that type of thing. So really focus it on those topics that senior leadership definitely cares about and weave that in. That goes back to ensuring also that you understand the business strategy for the organization and you can speak how business continuity can continue to drive that strategy.
Thanks very much. Our next question comes from someone who already has the C-level support for their business continuity program and says that their C-level executives understand the value. What they're trying to do now is incorporate resilience planning into the corporate culture. And their question for you is, how do we work our processes into the corporate culture and mindset?
That's a great question. Now, I'll say, because we've been talking about that throughout this interview, I would say that it truly depends on what the corporate culture is, on what the mission, the vision, what those items are. Let's say one of the key things that an organization has is around driving continued customer excellence or something of that nature. Well, what I would do is ensure that I understand what are the things that business continuity would be promoting that would support that particular portion of that mission or vision statement. And so if, depending on the industry that you're in the event that from a customer perspective, you need to have certain things up and running at all times, or you need to ensure that there's a engagement with the vendor is appropriate if you're reliant on vendors or vendors for outsourcing. Just ensure that you're able to underscore how having a plan in place will actually drive efficiency in being able to still meet that recovery objective. So if I go down in one particular area in terms of services or technology, if I am able to have that same technology transferred, or that same technology at another site that can immediately pick it up and have little to no impact on our customer support, that continues to not only drive the ability for our customers to trust us, it lends to our reputation. People will continue to say, you know, they had a situation, but they knew that this was important to me and they were able to get me back up and running. So I think just really making sure that you understand your mission, your vision, and the strategy that the organization is tracking to, and then just aligning some of the core pieces of your business continuity program to those strategies just to show the value.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot of value today, Michelle. We thank you so much for your generosity and your expertise and in your time, and for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're most welcome.
Thanks again to all today's speakers. I think they managed to pack a lot of information in this past hour. We have several upcoming options for you to begin the MBCP certification process with the Master's Case Study Review, a challenging interactive 2-day workshop that will prepare you to take the Master's Case Study examination and help establish you as a leader in your field. Upcoming course locations and dates include Dearborn, Michigan on October 7th through the 9th, online December 9th through the 10th, and of course at DRI 2020 in Savannah, Georgia, February 29th through March 1st. Head to the DRI course page on our website to register. Space is always limited in these courses. And of course, if you have a team of senior experts at your organization, you can reach out to me directly to set up a training program just for you and your team. You can reach me at 410-379-2101. I look forward to it. And be sure to join us at DRI 2020 in Savannah, Georgia, March 1st through the 4th for the premier resiliency event of the year, including top sessions led by MBCPs and other subject matter experts, and a special ceremony to induct the newest MBCPs into the Order of the Sword and Shield National Honor Society as part of the event kickoff on the morning of Monday, March 2nd. Visit our conference.drii.org website for more information. Now, if you still have questions that we didn't cover, give us a call at 866-542-3744. A recording of this and all our other webinars is posted on DRI.org. This webinar has been a production of DRI International 2019, all rights reserved. Thank you for your attention.